are shaping religions, and therefore, even if we can fairly talk about Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan in terms of the problems of particular interpretation of Islam as part of authoritarianism problem, to talk about Islam in general is very problematic and overgeneralization. The second thing is that if we look at religion in general, because in my first book I compared the United States, France, and Turkey, and discussing Catholicism, Protestantism, and Islam, and I regard Islam as an ordinary religion. You can find liberal, illiberal, democratic, authoritarian versions of any religion. Again, when I was giving this lecture in Japan, I had some Buddhist and Asian religious follower students, and they taught me that, no, you are wrong, professor. Why? Because when you talk about Abrahamic religions, you may be right, they look like each other, but we have Asian, for example, Buddhism is always peaceful. Then now we can say, look at Myanmar, right? These apolitical, peaceful, ascetic monks first protested the military regime, which was good, pro-democratic. But then they joined the slaughtering of Muslims in Myanmar, so that Time magazine came with a cover page saying that Buddhist terrorism in Myanmar. So I'm not saying that Buddhism is a terrorist religion, but I am saying that each and every religion, even Buddhism, may have a radical interpretation. So then, if we put this very general argument about religions, and in addition to agent structure dilemma in social science, another big question many people ask is the relationship between material and ideational factors. Okay, so one put a finger onto any religion, including Islam, the person theoretically avoids the importance of material factor. In this talk, I will emphasize more the role of material factor, and in Q&A we can talk about the interaction. Definitely agency and structure are both important and they are interacting, and ideas and material conditions are both important, but on certain cases, on certain period of time, material structures shape the others. You can call it as Marxist theory or any material structuralist theory. So, the argument I'm going to make is the following. When you look at 49 Muslim majority countries, you can divide them into 5 groups. One group is the countries in Europe, Turkey, Albania, Kosovo. And we have an electoral democracy in Albania. Kosovo is becoming, despite many problems of state building, and Turkey has a particular condition I'm going to talk at the very end. Another region is South Asia, including Indonesia, Bangladesh, and some other countries, smaller population, mostly follow the region, the general average of democracy in Southeast Asia. Then Sub-Saharan Africa, you have Mali, Niger, Senegal, and until very recently, most Muslim majority countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, despite very abject poverty, were democracies, and many still are. And they are not worse than their non-Muslim neighbors. Some of them are better than them, like Senegal. So therefore, the main problem of Muslim authoritarianism is focusing on the Middle East and Central Asia. In other 3 parts, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, we don't see a unique problem. The unique problem is in 2 regions, Middle East and Central Asia. Except Tunisia, there is no democracy out of around 30 countries in these 2 regions. So what makes these 2 regions similarly authoritarian? That's the question the scholars of Islam and democracy keep asking. So when you say it's Islam, this is very problematic. Why? Because I've been to Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. I know Azerbaijan fairly well. So Islam plays today very, very limited role in these countries because of a century-long Russian colonization followed by 70 years of Soviet atheist propaganda, now ruled still the Soviet nomenclatura, and Islam has played very limited role in current dominant political elite of these countries. They are not like Saudi Arabia or Gulf countries. So there should be something other than Islam to explain the problem of authoritarianism in these two regions. That's one thing. The second thing is that when you look at public surveys, such as world value surveys, when Muslims are asked about democracy, 80% favor democracy as the best regime. That's at least normally in a survey. You may be skeptical of surveys, but that's the general problem of surveys. And the non-Muslims and Muslims are almost the same in terms of public survey. Another thing is that when we compare the 11 Muslim democracies with 38 autocracies, if Islam is the dominant thing, why didn't it make all of them authoritarian? Why 11 of them are different? So we have to explain the variation within Muslim countries as well. What is the explanation of the variation? One thing Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis have emphasized, so late Samuel Huntington and still living Bernard Lewis, is the lack of secularism. And for them, the best example is Atatürk's Turkey, as democracy, as secular state. And that's the problem of all other Muslim countries. But that's very broad understanding. Why? Because Huntington, so my advisor, Joel Migdal, kept telling me to be nice to Huntington, not to criticize him too much, because Huntington was his advisor. So he was the advisor of my advisor, but I still criticize him, saying that he's not an expert on Islam. His understanding of Islam very general. Bernard Lewis was an expert on Turkey. Therefore, there's the reason these two focus on Turkey. When we look at 49 Muslim majority countries, in fact, Turkey is not the only secular state. 13 of them are secular states. In the world, out of 197 countries, only 27 of them have the term secular in their constitution. Secular republic, secular state. Only 27. And 13 of 27 are Muslim majority countries. And despite being secular states, most of these Muslim countries are authoritarian. So therefore, secularism may be to a certain extent necessary, but definitely not sufficient. It didn't make Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, to a certain extent Uzbekistan, or Chad, or Turkey, even Turkey, automatically democratic. Because secularism in Turkey started in 1924, democratic elections started about 3 decades later, as you know. Then there are many back and forths, coup d'etats, interventions. Despite secularism, there is so much trouble and problems going on. So we cannot explain the fact that out of 13 Muslim majority countries, secular state, majority are authoritarian. And also we have some Muslim countries like Indonesia, Bangladesh, having better democracy score than almost all other secular Muslim states, but they are not that much secular. Bangladesh has Islam as official religion. Tunisia has a very good constitution now, but it still says Islam is the religion of Tunisia. And therefore, there is more mixture, as we have also seen in the European examples. Out of 15 major members, early members of the EU, 5 had established churches. Sweden disestablished later. So it's not a black and white thing to have religion as part of public discourse or not. So, what is my alternative? The alternative is the following. Democracy is always a regional phenomenon. If you look at Europe, at the end of the Second World War, most European countries had authoritarian regimes. Then as a region, they change. Then the southern Europe, we can maybe call Greece, Spain, Portugal, the last 3 with military dictatorship, then they change. And then regional shift was way more visible in Eastern Europe. As you know better than me, in 2 years, entire Eastern Europe changed from autocracy to democracy. In Latin America, in 1979, 75% of the regimes were military dictatorship. In 1993, the number of military dictatorships was 0. So, regions include several members affecting each other, and autocracy or democracy becomes a mood of the region. So, but then you can ask, why do these two regions, Middle East and Central Asia, have this dominant authoritarian mood? So, I would argue that that's because of their economic structure. The economy shapes religion, economy shapes politics. So what is the exceptional aspect of the economic structure? It's rentierism. What is the source of rentierism or rent? It's oil and natural gas in these countries. So in the United States, we had the motto in the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. In most Muslim countries, the motto is the opposite. The king of Saudi Arabia implicitly says, no representation without taxation. You, the people, don't pay me tax. Why should I give you representation? Because economy is almost entirely based on oil money. Oil money is monopolized by the government, and then the government's need to taxation is limited. And Middle East is the only region in the world where the majority of government revenues comes from rents and rent revenue rather than taxation. And if we look at these two regions, the mechanism of authoritarianism is based on the following. First of all, there is limited taxation, therefore the people lack the leverage to use against the government, because in a normal system, if the government do not follow people's demands, then the people may stop paying tax. If the government forces them to pay tax, then they may leave the country. But in a rentier, oil-based, oil-dependent economy, the fact that people leave doesn't mean anything to the king, to the ruler, because oil stays. You cannot put oil in your luggage and carry it outside. It's a joke, right? So, then that's one mechanism. The second mechanism is that in oil-rich rentier states, the rulers are not only independent of people's taxation, but they make the people dependent on themselves, because the rulers allocate money to the people. They distribute oil money to the people. Therefore, they buy out people's loyalty. Therefore, they build patron-client relationship with the people. Therefore, the people cannot revolt against their boss. So in political science, we have very few law type generalization. One is the following: no bourgeoisie, no democracy. If there is no independent business class, some may call middle class, some may say bourgeoisie, some may say an organized labor. None of them exist in an oil-rich, oil-dependent country, because oil is not a labor-intensive sector. In Saudi Arabia, over half of government revenue comes from oil, and about half of GDP is almost coming from oil. And oil sector use only 1.5% of the labor. It doesn't need labor. So it's not labor-intensive thing. Therefore, the king doesn't need people's labor. Therefore, it has its money, it allocates money to the people, and by this oil money, the rulers establishing media is a propaganda machine. They establish very strong security apparatus, and they hinder the emergence of an independent economic class, social, civil society, even political opposition. So I've been to Turkmenistan and Qatar 4 months for each. Normally they are very different countries. One is Arabic, the other Turkic. One was former Soviet, former communist. The other is a Gulf monarchy with Sharia courts. But one thing very similar, that the both are exclusively dependent on natural gas. And when you take a newspaper, in Turkmenistan it's written The owner of this newspaper is in Turkmenistan, Turkmenbashi, at the time that it was Turkmenbashi, the president of the country. And in Qatar, it's the emir, the king of the country. So that's the mechanism making countries authoritarian in Middle East and Central Asia. You may ask, okay, what about oil-rich countries in the other parts of the world, like Norway? So in my article, I look at all the countries in the world and use the general criterion in the literature, which is that if 40% of government's revenue comes from oil, we call it a rentier state. And there are, out of 197 countries in the world, 28 rentier states. 25 of them are authoritarian. There are only 3 small exceptions, 2 in Latin America, 1 is in Pacific, and they are under the influence of their bigger, more powerful democratic neighbors. But with these 3 exceptions, all 25, or out of 28, 25 are authoritarian. And out of 28, 20 are Muslim countries. So that explains, and most of them are in Central Asia and Middle East. That explains, at least partially, this disproportionate authoritarianism in Muslim majority countries. So the next question is, how come and why Muslim countries are so oil rich? Does that have anything to do with Islam? The answer is no. Why? Because it's just chance that they have 60% of the world's oil reserves. They didn't do anything, so no credit to them. If it's a curse, God cursed them. I don't know why. Okay, it's a blessing, God bless them. But it's a fact that normally they are supposed to get 25% of the world's oil, because they are 25% of the world's population, 25% of the number of states in the world, but they have 60% of oil and gas. Other than Muslim countries, we have other examples. For example, Russia and Venezuela. The authoritarianism in both Russia and Venezuela followed the rise of oil prices. In fact, it was mostly followed by the US invasion of Iraq. And then in the United States, we had a major conspiracy theory that the United States is going to push the oil prices down in order to kick Putin out. But it didn't happen. But that was the idea. Many people believe in that. If the oil prices go down, then Putin will have to leave. So it's really related to the rentier economy rather than particular culture. Even in the United States, we have some important analysis to show that oil-rich states in the United States, like Louisiana and Texas, are more likely to be prone to kind of authoritarian, which means that the incumbent government is more likely to stay, because the governor of Louisiana and Texas are using oil money to have more media influence, to buy out people's loyalty. Even in the United States, oil has a negative impact in terms of more competitive electoral system. So, one more question, which is that, do I have more time?
Oh, yeah.
Is that, okay, when we look at these 2 regions, Central Asia and Middle East, there are oil-poor countries, and they are still authoritarian. How can we explain Jordan, Syria, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan? That's the main challenge to the whole idea and argument. And one way of explaining is to combine my emphasis on regional diffusion, the regional trend of political regime, with the idea of oil, saying that the impact of oil is not simply limited by the borders, especially if oil-rich countries are so influential as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Algeria, Iraq in Middle East. And out of 17 countries in the Middle East, Muslim majority, 11 are oil-rich countries or rentier states. Only 6. The 6 are numerically minority, and also they are in smaller countries like Lebanon, Jordan. And even these countries are very much affected by their rich neighbors through international loans and debts they receive, and then there's the remittances they are getting from their workers. So therefore, larger influential countries making the Middle East as a rentier region. And similarly in Central Asia, in addition to other factors such as the Soviet legacy, we have the rentier influence of Russia as big brother, then Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan. So Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are geographically small, economically poor, and open to be influenced by their authoritarian neighbors in terms of both economy and politics. So, then, if this is the argument, regional diffusion and rentierism are major reasons for authoritarianism, how can we explain that Turkey, which is an oil-poor country, and which is supposed to be influenced by the most democratic regional organization, the European Union, how come it has become an authoritarian? So today I would define Turkey as an authoritarian regime. It's not a democracy. It's scientifically false to define it as a democracy. That's my argument. How? I would say that despite being oil poor, Tayyip Erdogan has created a rentier state using, first of all, international loans, because when he came to power, the total international debt of Turkey was less than $150 billion. Today, it's more than $400 billion. Second, privatization. They have sold many public institutions. The total amount is around $50 billion. The third thing, the Erdogan regime has seized properties of many opposition business people, starting with Kara Mehmet, the Çukurova holding, certain. Then recently, more direct seizure, defining the Gülen movement, the Hizmet movement led by Fethullah Gülen as a terrorist organization, then expropriating certain private properties of certain business people linked or affiliated or allegedly affiliated with the movement. One is Akın İpek, for example, and İpek has the Koza İpek holding, which is the last 5 years made the profit of total around $500 million. Therefore, the total amount of the wealth may be more than $10 billion. So this kind of seizure also is becoming part of Erdogan's pool. And another thing, maybe more important than the other, is to selling Istanbul piece by piece as if it's an oil reserve. And in fact, the Gezi events occurred in 2013 was a reaction to Erdogan's attempt to sell Istanbul as a rentier revenue. And the people of Istanbul finally say no to see the park becoming a residency or a mall in terms of making the green area a rent for the rentier system of Erdogan. So in this rentier system of Erdogan, he is using government tenders, bids, to channel money to his cronies. These crony capitalist business people are receiving money from the government, and on behalf of Erdogan, they are controlling media outlets, newspapers, TV channels. And also another part of this rentier mechanism is the fact that Erdogan's government is allocating money to about 15 million people in Turkey. So 15 million low-income people are receiving government support. If these people regard it as government support, therefore freely vote whatever party they want, that would be perfectly fine. But the problem is that these 15 million people are forced to believe that this is an AKP money or this is an Erdogan's money and favor. Therefore, they are appreciative to Erdogan's personality or the AKP rather than a public general national understanding of the government support. So that's the rentierism without oil. You may call it as a genius, you may call it as a short-term risky adventure. And the second part, regional diffusion, is also in fact explaining the case of Turkey. Why? Because at the beginning, the AKP government was promising to make Turkey a member of European Union, and European Union had very positive impacts on Turkish political system. But then, mostly by the Arab Spring, Erdogan first felt that the military was already pushed to barracks, therefore he has a chance to assert his personal leadership. But he wasn't satisfied by Turkey per se. He wanted to become the leader of the Middle East, and if not all Arab, if not all Muslim countries. And then he really turned his face toward the Middle East and some other non-Western countries, such as Russia. The Putin's strongman attitude became a kind of model, and which is another rentier state, Russia. And then Erdogan got a palace built in front of Atatürk's forest garden, or Atatürk's forest garden. It's imitating Saudi Arabian type of palace with no history, no culture, no passé, which overnight you have a palace with luxury of 1,100 rooms. And then right now the best friend of the Erdogan regime are Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So these Gulf frontier states really establishing a diffusion between Turkey and these regimes. Therefore, the current authoritarianism in Turkey is directly linked to the fact that Erdogan is building a rentier economy, rentier state, and having closer relations with Islamist and rentier authoritarian Arab regimes. So, to sum up, in order to have more time as a dialogue in question and answers, I would say that there is a problem when you look at number and then other factors. This problem can be more specified if we focus on two regions, Middle East and Central Asia. And then what makes these two regions similar is the importance of oil-based rentierism. And this oil-based rentierism can even explain some oil-poor countries having direct connection with oil money through their neighbors. And Turkey has unfortunately recently become one of the countries under the influence of Gulf money, establishing a rentier state at home and having friendship with Gulf Islamic rentier neighbors. But referring to the question, the tough question, does Islam promote authoritarianism? The answer is neither yes nor no. The answer is it depends. If there is a rentier mechanism, any religion you put would create certain problems, because in order to promote a democratic understanding of Islam, we need a competitive market in which people can see and pick and choose alternatives. If you have an authoritarian regime, the authoritarian regime use religion, and in this case Islam, as a justification mechanism, and doesn't allow the emergence of any alternative views. Even if there are Muslims promoting democracy, promoting and trying to promote the relationship between EU and Turkey, for example, in the case of Turkey, the authoritarian regime doesn't wish to see the emergence of these alternatives, and they prefer a more obedient Islam. And recently, together with the authoritarianism of the regime, we see a more close-minded understanding of Islam emerging in Turkey. A more anti-Western discourses are in rise. So therefore, I would say that, yes, of course, certain interpretations of Islam are problematic in terms of their relation with democracy. But we have to ask whether these interpretations are sometimes the effect of authoritarianism rather than its cause. So thanks for listening. If you have questions, I will be happy to receive them.
Thank you very much. Definitely we have questions. I think we would largely go along with you when you said that Islam is not the only factor to explain authoritarianism, and it's much more complex. It's, as you said, it's rentierism or traditions or even diffusion. Although I find the word regional diffusion already a little bit. It has to be explained, and this is, I think, goes without objection. What is surprising for me, and this is something we have to probably raise some questions concerning it, is to equate Turkey with the rentier state. And it's a very interesting thesis. I haven't heard it, and so probably we shall ask you for more explanation. The questions. Okay, we start with the question period, and I would like to raise the question about where you position Iran in this scenario. But before we do that, we first ask some of the audience to.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Can I also ask your name?
Mahun Dawn.
For everyone, yes.
I would ask you to have a few words on Pakistan, for example.